Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Office of the Chief Scientist Seminar Series. I'm Andrew Paul, if you don't know me, and I'm a Senior Science Advisor with the Office of the Chief Scientist. The purpose of these seminars is to provide an opportunity for us to get together, exchange knowledge on interesting science that's happening across Alberta, and to do it in an open learning and sharing environment. I'd like to start today's seminar off with respectfully acknowledging that we're broadcasting today from traditional lands of Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. This includes territory of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota, Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Saulteaux nations, and many others whose cultures continue to influence our communities today. Just to remind folks, we are recording today's seminar. Recordings from previous seminars are available on the Alberta Environment Protected Areas YouTube page, and new recordings will be posted there in the future as they become available. So to help maintain our call quality today, everyone's video and audio has been disabled, but feel free to enter your questions or comments at any time during the presentation into the chat window in Teams. After the presentation is concluded, I'll read out those questions to our presenters in the order that they were received. So with that, I would like to start now to welcome our presenters today, Kate Churchill and Heather Lazaruk with Alberta Forestry and Parks, and they will be presenting on Protected Areas Management Effectiveness Program in Alberta. Kate Churchill joined the Parks Division as a planner in 2016 after working as a municipal land use planner in the Peace River region. Kate co-led development of the Protected Area Management Effectiveness Program and continues to champion and lead this program. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Geography from the University of Victoria and a Master's of Planning from the University of Calgary. Heather Lazaruk is a Senior Systems Planner in the Parks Division, and she has worked as a practitioner and subject matter expert in the Parks and Protected Areas field since 2004. Heather co-led the Canadian Expert Task Team and background on Protected Areas Management Effectiveness for the Pathway to Canada Target 1 initiative. She's been a champion for management effectiveness across Canada and is co-author of the Adapted Program and Tools for Parks Division. Heather has an educational background in physical geography, marine biology, and interdisciplinary resource and environmental management. And with that, Kate and Heather, I will turn it over to you for what will be a great presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andy. All right. So Heather and I are here today. We're going to tell you about Protected Area Management Effectiveness, also known as PAME, and the program that we developed for Alberta Parks. So we're going to start off talking about what PAME is, and we'll talk about the Alberta Parks PAME program, including the tools and the process that we developed. And then we'll end with an overview about the Alberta PAME guidebook that was developed in partnership with the Office of the Chief Scientist. And then we would love to take some of your questions at the end of our presentation. So Heather, why PAME?
Awesome. So we thought actually we'd start before we get into the nitty-gritty details and all the things that you really want to hear, give you some context about PAME, what it is, and why we're here. First of all, pretty self-explanatory. PAME, actually Protected Areas Management Effectiveness, refers specifically to protected areas. And I mean, when I'm referring to that, I am specifically talking about those sites that actually meet the IUCN definition of a protected area, effectively as sites that have as their primary and overriding objective the long-term conservation of nature. Part of a global family of protected areas worldwide. And when we take a look at Alberta and the Alberta context, we can see that in a case of the PAME program that we have developed, so in the context of the provincial system of parks and protected areas, only about 259 sites in the park system out of 464 actually meet that definition and have as their overriding objective the conservation of nature. So this makes up just under 7% of the province, over 4 million hectares that's actually dedicated to the conservation of nature. When you look at and add all in all of the other types of protected areas under other governance types like private or federal, that number actually climbs to 15%. So for those sites, PAME is a really important means by which we can start to evaluate and understand if they're meeting their objectives. The second major piece of context that PAME came from was in response to biodiversity declines. And recognizing the potential that protected areas have in helping to stem the loss of biodiversity. So the two graphs that I have here from the Living Planet Index, which is a measure of the state's of the state of the world's biological diversity based on population trends. So the graph on the left actually illustrates the overall decline in abundance of terrestrial species by about 69% from 1970 to 2018. When that same lens is applied to protected areas, we see that for the same species over the same time periods, that the rate of decline is significantly less, 1/3, almost less than half of the rate of decline of the overall terrestrial protected area, or LPI. So essentially, protected areas have been really successful in not necessarily preventing, but certainly in slowing the rate of biodiversity decline. And knowing that protected areas have this potentially critical role, actually understanding why they're working, what makes them effective, and what management actions we can take to actually make them maximize their potential in biodiversity and stemming the loss of biodiversity is really critical. When we look at to try and understand from the literature what are the drivers, there's a whole number of explanatory variables that have been identified, from design to the different kinds of species, ecological traits, the management type of protected areas, even seemingly unconnected socioeconomic factors like corruption or national GDP, and even the age of a protected area have significant influence on biodiversity outcomes. So there's a whole range of factors here, and what we do know from the literature is that protected areas are being effective, but the metrics of success are fairly weak, and that there's a whole range of predictors of success and failure. And this is incredibly important with PAME because it enables us to have a common framework by which we can actually start to understand and understand how protected areas can be effective in achieving their outcomes. So it was one of the primary benefits and a key factor for us incorporating and integrating PAME into the work that we wanted to do. And Kate's going to talk to you a little bit about the framework itself.
Great. Thanks, Heather. So as Heather just talked about, this is why the PAME framework is key. It's based on criteria that have been demonstrated to predict biodiversity outcomes. So outside of North America, it's quite common for protected areas to be funded by NGOs, funded privately, and these organizations require reporting about how protected areas are doing. They want to understand what their return on investment is. So as a result, protected area organizations have been undertaking independent management evaluations for decades. And in 2000, the IUCN reviewed thousands of these evaluations, and they created a standardized framework, the PAME framework. And this is to help organizations to assess how well an area is being managed. And now there's lots of tools, evaluation tools that are based on this framework. So the framework itself, it focuses on three main themes. Within those themes, there's 6 management components, and these align with what you'd see in a typical management cycle. So we start by understanding the context and the planning associated with the site, understanding the kind of inputs that have been allocated towards management, understanding the implementation of different types of management processes, and then finally looking at the results of these components in terms of their impacts and their outcomes. So once we understood internally as an organization what the value of PAME is, we partnered with Dr. Pam Wright. She's a national PAME expert, and we undertook a PAME pilot project in 2017. So we started off by by brainstorming some ideas on what we actually want to achieve with a PAME program. And we came up with 4 goals. They're all based on research that talks about what can actually be achieved through management evaluation. But number 1, we wanted an adaptive management tool to deepen our understanding of our sites so that we can improve management. Number 2, like all protected area organizations, we wanted to understand how to make the greatest impact with our limited resource management dollars. Number 3, we wanted to promote accountability and transparency by being able to communicate how we're actually doing. And then finally, we wanted to design a program that could be applied at multiple scales. So looking beyond just that site level application to more of a broader system of protected areas. So after we knew what our goals were, we picked our PAME tools, and we'll talk about that in more detail in the next section. But our next step, was to pick sites to evaluate. We selected 6 sites based on a range of criteria. We really wanted to look at a diversity of sites across the province, looking at different sizes and classifications, different values, locations, issues, different intensity of use. And also knowing that there are varying levels of information and management guidance available on a site-by-site basis. Our final list included 3 provincial parks, 3 wildland provincial parks, and 1 provincial recreation area that is part of the Lakeland complex. We had northern sites that are remote with low levels of use, sites that are high frequency of use. We had an urban site, and we had sites in 3 of the 4 park regions. So this pilot was instrumental in helping us to refine the tools and hone the process. After evaluating the pilot, once the pilot project was complete, we developed the Alberta Parks PAME program. And so the next section, I'll get into more detail about that program in terms of the tools and the process. All right, Heather, what is Alberta PAME?
What is Alberta PAME? Thanks, Kate. The pilot was actually wildly successful, and our staff and our management team were really excited about it. The suite of tools that now make up what is the Alberta Parks PAME program are really actually 5 main tools. They're housed in 2 different Excel multi-worksheet Excel tools. And the whole program is actually anchored by the main tool, which is the Management Effectiveness Tracking tool. That was adopted during the pilot process with BC Parks and Ontario Parks. It's called CanMet to stand for the Canadian version of the MET, which is a global tool that was developed by the World Wildlife Fund, and it's been used in thousands of evaluations globally. The tool has also been, the CanMet tool was adapted specifically to the Alberta context using Alberta language and Alberta questions. And this component on the right-hand side is really the actual evaluation mechanism. The remaining tools that you see on this screen are really focused on informing the context piece of the PAME framework that Kate talked about. So they were designed to enable us to get a better collective and holistic understanding of our protected area when we're doing an assessment, looking at both conservation and human dimensions. The original MET tool and many of the other evaluation tools that are used globally have an integrated threats and values assessment tools, but we recognized right off the bat in the pilot that these were really inadequate to meeting the objectives that we wanted. In particular, we have huge information gaps in the Protected Areas program, and we recognized that a more robust approach to developing these tools was going to help us along the road. We also recognized that most tools are focused solely on conservation values, and in protected areas, in our experience, the human dimensions, the recreation components are intrinsically interlinked with conservation values. And so we developed an additional toolkit called the Human Dimensions Toolkit that helped us to actually understand that holistic perspective. So all of these tools that you see on the left-hand side, we are designed to systematically and comprehensively guide an assessment for an individual protected area, looking at the values and also on the design risks associated with a protected area that might actually have an implication on the long-term maintenance of the values in question. And both of the conservation and human dimensions also have a threats assessment toolkit that's developed to help identify the main threats. So the first suite of tools that we developed were focused on conservation. And I have to say that thank goodness for borrowing materials. The original values assessment was actually borrowed from BC Parks, but it was actually subsequently heavily adapted and modified and improved upon by our very own Dr. Joyce Gould when she worked here in Alberta Parks and with the Office of the Chief Scientist. And we're very thankful to that. She worked with a whole host of colleagues across many disciplines to inform and improve the eventual tool that we have now, that we're using now. Essentially, the toolkit that we have is what I would call a comprehensive shopping list that has a range of potential values for both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. It looks at values from a variety of scales, from landscapes to genetics, and it includes a range of values associated with ecosystem structure, with composition, and with ecological function. There's also a component, there's fewer questions, but focused on the design risk, as I mentioned, looking at elements of protected areas design, including shape, size, and connectivity that have that may pose a risk to the long-term persistence of conservation values. In the end, there's about 35 main variables. You see some of the broad categories here on the screen that are subdivided into 53 individual components and the 7 design risks, which we actually then score. We've also included placeholders in the tool for things that we think we ought to know, but we may not necessarily either have the data or the evidence or the methodology to inform. But it allows us to provide comments and pull in any subject matter expertise on that as we go through a process. Ideally, these assessment tools are filled out by a specialist familiar with the site, working to capture and score the information here from a variety of sources, from spatial data sets, inventories, reports, management plans. Ideally, we would have information to inform every single one of these variables objectively, but that's just not the reality here in Alberta for our protected areas. And it's one of the reasons why there's a huge benefit in completing the assessment as a part of a broader PAME workshop process. It allows us to verify and to further inform each one of these variables subjectively by site matter experts that would be in a workshop to get a better picture, a more complete picture of the site's values. Importantly, one of the elements that we incorporated into the values tool was identification of whether an individual value might be actually an information gap or a research priority. And that helps us with prioritization and data acquisition needs. The threats tool is the second component of the conservation toolkit, and it's paired and looks primarily at threats to the conservation values, which we've just gone through and assessed. This tool was also an adaptation of an original tool that was actually developed by NatureServe and used by COSEWIC to assess species at risk and ecosystems of concern. And we adapted it to actually function at a site level, and it's working really well. So the tool is designed to capture those primary threats that come from both inside a site and outside a site. And we look at factors like scope, severity, and timing in relationship to every one of the threats. And the categories you see up on the screen are those that we use in the tool. This is a standardized threats classification that was developed by the IUCN CMP as an open source standard for protected areas threats across the world. And ultimately, when we fill out the assessment, it helps us to identify what are the primary threats to the conservation values that we had identified, and ultimately identify those that are of immediate concern that might need management attention. The second suite of tools are the Human Dimensions Toolkit. This suite of tools was actually developed in-house, and originally the Human Dimensions Toolkit was primarily focused on recreation and a little bit of human use. But as we work through the pilot process, we continue to refine and add to the tool a whole host of much wider other values to capture both use and non-use values. In the end, what we have is a tool that actually captures a huge range of human-centric values, not only from recreation, but including education, scientific, cultural, historic, tourism, other economic and stewardship values. Essentially, the tool basically mirrors the structure of the conservation tool in that it looks at values, a range of values from a number of different scales, all the way from ecosystem or system-wide to site-specific. And it includes an element, as the other one does, on design and capacity risks that are particularly relevant to human dimensions. I do need to note, or Kate will remind me to later, that there are overlaps, obviously, with Indigenous values from many of these things, both conservation and human dimensions. But we recognize that it's a recognized gap. They're not included in this tool right now. We are hoping to identify and develop separate tools and processes and expertise to be able to capture Indigenous values so that Indigenous communities can participate in evaluations in a meaningful way and looking at sites from not the Western scientific perspective, which is what these ones are from. So the threats assessment tool is the other half of the human dimensions toolkit, and similar to the conservation toolkit, it shares the same basic structure. The main difference is that it uses a different typology of threats. So we actually tried to use the CMP open source standard classification of threats for protected areas in relationship to the human dimensions values, and it just fundamentally didn't work at all. So we actually had to start from scratch during the pilot, and what we ended up with was a threats assessment tool that was developed in-house and is working very well. Similar to the threats assessment for conservation, we look at the scope of the threat to the particular human dimensions that we're talking about, as well as severity and timing. And Kate is going to talk to you a little bit about the CanMet tool.
Yes. So the CanMet Alberta tool. So Heather had talked about this earlier, but this tool is based on the MET, or the Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool, which is a PAME tool that was developed by the World Wildlife Fund. It's one of the most commonly used. It's simple and elegant, very easy to use and adapt, which is why we liked it. As Heather said, we adapted it quite a bit to fit into a Canadian Alberta context, and that's why we call it the CanMet AB. So the tool itself is also housed in an Excel workbook. It's a qualitative survey. Each question addresses one of the management components within the PAME framework. There's around 50 questions. Most of the questions have 4 possible answers. They're worth up to 3 points. The points are then tallied and the site is given an overall score. And then the questions associated with each management component are also scored to give you a breakdown of how a site does within each specific management component. So when we're running this in a workshop setting, our approach is to hand everyone their own set of questions and give them about 30 to 40 minutes to go through and mark down their own answers. And then we go through each question afterwards together as a group and discuss until we can reach a consensus on how many points to give it. And what we have found is that this discussion and getting to consensus is one of the most essential parts of the process, because we can develop a shared rationale together for why we're scoring a question the way we want to. And then we also have a better understanding of each other's perspectives on a particular issue. So now I want to talk about the process. The tools are really great, have a lot of use. We've used them in a lot of different ways. What we have experienced is that the key to a successful PAME is really good process. In fact, research has shown, and we've seen this play out in a workshop setting, just doing the evaluation, even if the recommendations are not formally adopted, does have a positive impact on management. So the Alberta PAME evaluation consists of a 2-day workshop, but it requires at least 6 weeks of preparation. And a lot of that preparation is scoping out who to invite, when and where it will be held, adapting tools if necessary, pre-briefing participants about PAME. An important note on who to invite, we've found that involving a wide range of participants with knowledge of the site is best practice. Having folks who have that site level expertise and knowledge, those boots on the ground people, so park rangers, maintenance supervisors, ecologists, visitor services, operations managers, directors, infrastructure, trail coordinators, as well as folks with technical or subject matter expertise is ideal. It's a way to keep biases in check, but it also provides that opportunity for collective learning about the site from different perspectives. This was a very common piece of feedback that we got from participants when we evaluated the pilot project. For many participants, these workshops changed the way that they thought about how a site was being managed, which we thought was very powerful. Another thing we like to note is that these tools, this process, are they're not set up to assess or evaluate individual performance of park staff. So it's really important to note that up front as well. So the majority of that 6 weeks of prep time is actually spent gathering the data that is used to inform the evaluation. Heather walked us through what's actually involved in filling in those spreadsheets, the values and threats assessments. And the way that we run a workshop is very deliberate. Every workshop starts by going through that conservation values assessment and the threats assessment first. And then we move on to the human dimension values assessment and the threats assessment for that one. And then the workshop ultimately culminates in doing that CanMet Alberta evaluation. So the slide previous, that evaluation. A key learning that we gained through the pilot project was how important it is to spend that time needed going through the values and threats assessments, because it really helps to clarify for everybody, no matter what their role is, what values that site is being managed to protect and what their role is in doing that. The conservation values assessment in particular can be a really huge learning curve for many participants, but it's really, really valuable. Also, the opportunity to identify and rank the threats to those values provides that space for staff to be able to share what their biggest challenges are with site management. So the bulk of the workshop is actually spent on the values and threats assessments. It's well worth the time, we've always found. If we spend the time on that together, then we're better able to link this shared understanding about the values and the threats of the site to the management effectiveness questions. So after a workshop, we compile the results, we share them with regional staff, and they can be integrated into work plans and management plans, action plans. A really good example, if you're interested in seeing what that looks like, is the Lois Hole Centennial Provincial Park Management Plan. You can find that on the Alberta Parks website. It was the very first workshop we ever ran as part of the pilot, and it was to support the development of the management plan for that site. So that's a really great resource. So a PAME evaluation should be repeated periodically to assess progress, especially if there's been a significant change to a site, like a boundary change or a major disturbance. So that's the process. So now we're going to talk about the guidebook, the Alberta PAME Guidebook. So this was developed in partnership with the Office of the Chief Scientist, who contracted Dr. Pam Wright to produce a guidance document and update the tools. So Pam, as I mentioned before, is a national expert on PAME, and she actually co-authored with Heather the development of the policy working paper on PAME for the Pathway to Canada Target 1 process. I urge you to check that out online. It's a great PAME resource. Pam was integral to the development and implementation of the Alberta Parks PAME pilot, and she did a brilliant job of putting this guidebook together. I'd also like to take this time to say thank you to Dr. Joyce Gould, who I know is out there. She initiated the guidebook process with the OCS. She's one of the co-founders and creators of the Alberta PAME program. Joyce and Pam are both retired, but they've both contributed significantly to advancing management effectiveness in Canada and Alberta, and we're Heather and I are grateful that we've gotten to work with them on this. So the guidebook consists of 3 volumes. It pulls together and organizes all of the information and learnings acquired to date. It's intended to be a starting point for anyone interested in developing and implementing a management effectiveness program or integrating an approach, a management effectiveness approach. So Heather will walk briefly through what each volume consists of, and then we'll be happy to take your questions.
This is the easiest part of the presentation because the guidebooks really speak for themselves once you open them up. Kate and I have been champions, as well as Pam and Joyce, and I'm not getting any younger, and I'm hoping to retire one day and pass the torch. And so it's a huge benefit to have these guidebooks as resources that will aid not only us in doing the work that we do, but potentially can aid anybody else who wants to undertake a program, who wants to take this program and adapt it to their own uses and their own context, which is best practice in protected areas management globally and in Canada. So these are pretty cool. So the first there's 3 volumes in the guidebooks, and this is the first volume is really for those of you who are new to PAME, who don't know what the heck we're talking about, and don't even know what PAME stands for. So they just walk you through in volume 1 the background and the development and the benefits of PAME. And there's also a really great description of the Alberta Parks pilot program that was undertaken and some of the results that that we came to. The second volume is the start of the nitty-gritty, and it really focuses on the process. And I can't overstate how important the process is. We know from the literature that doing a bad PAME is almost worse than not doing a PAME. So the process is really critically important. This is one that we have found that we developed for Parks Division that's really successful and is really well supported actually by management, by our staff. So we know that it works well. So the second volume is really an overview, not only the tools, but literally gives you some great instruction and ideas on how to undertake a PAME process, including who might you want to invite, gathering the data, conducting a workshop, reporting, has some reporting tools in there, and some examples that are really well worthwhile. So this is really great and meaty, and there's some actual examples in there. In particular, BC Parks has done a really good job at working with Indigenous communities and in a process that looks at Indigenous values from different ways of knowing and understanding. And there's a good description in the second volume on how you might undertake working with Indigenous communities to get at these kinds of values in a different way, which is really cool. And the last volume is the one that is going to become the most dog-eared. This is the one that we have by our sides, that we sleep under our pillows. It's really the technical handbook that is literally the question-by-question guide to every single one of the 5 tools. So it tells you not only what it is that we're talking about with an individual question, but it also gives you a sense in Alberta of where some of that data might exist, where it doesn't exist, who might you need to talk to, or who might have some of that information for a given site. So it's really a valuable tool, and it's the one that probably you'll use the most in carrying out a PAME itself. And Kate, do you have anything to add?
No.
Great.
Ready for questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather and Kate. That was that was wonderful. We are running out of time. I'm going to call it there for questions, but we will share all of the questions that are in here with Kate and Heather. And I encourage folks to reach out to both Kate and Heather if you want to follow up with them directly. and included are some kudos on your work here as well. So yeah, look, please read through the rest of the comments here, because I think there's great appreciation for your work. I again want to thank everyone for joining and staying with us through the questions. Just want to remind folks that our next science seminar will be the last one of this winter season, and that'll be on Tuesday, April 23rd. We'll be hosting Dr. Evelyn Merrill from the University of Alberta, and she'll be presenting on chronic wasting disease in Alberta. I hope folks can join us for that one. Reminder, if you're not on the regular mailing list for these science seminars, please send an email to ap.ocs@gov.ab.ca, the Office of the Chief Scientist email, asking to be signed up on the notification for these science seminars. And with that, I want to just thank Kate and Heather one more time for sharing this work with you, with us, and a really great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.